And every day in the courtroom, I stood proudly before a judge and I said 5 words: Kamala Harris for the people. And to be clear, my entire career, I've only had one client, the people. And so, on behalf of the people, on behalf of every American, regardless of party, race, gender, or the language your grandmother speaks, on behalf of my mother and everyone who has ever set out on their own unlikely journey, on behalf of Americans like the people I grew up with, people who work hard, chase their dreams, and look out for one another, on behalf of everyone whose story could only be written in the greatest nation on earth, I accept your nomination to be President of the United States of America.
There was Kamala Harris at the Democratic National Convention last Thursday as she accepted the nomination as Democratic presidential candidate for the 5th of November US election. She entered the stage only a month ago, but her brand of progressive, inclusive, and common sense populism has been infectious. She replaces Joe Biden at the top of the Democratic ticket. Biden, unprecedentedly, dropped out of the race and endorsed her, bowing to pressures from his own party after a pretty bad performance in the 27th of June debate with Donald Trump. Kamala, the underdog, has surprised everybody, is now leading the presidential race in most polls, even though her advantage, we should say, it's only within the margin of error. Thanks to her, Democrats now have a fighting chance against the Republicans, and Americans, but also those of us in the rest of the world that follow closely American events, have found again hope in the midst of internal and global turmoil. As Michelle Obama put it at the same convention a few days ago, hope is making a comeback. This is the first episode of Weird, a global take on the US election. My name is Vito Laterza. I'm an anthropologist and political analyst, and I'm based at the University of Agder, where I'm an associate professor. The university is in Kristiansand, a small city in the southern tip of Norway, from where I'm talking now. From New York, we have my anthropologist colleague and friend Louis Römer. We're providing a different perspective on the US election, informed by our backgrounds spanning several countries and continents. I'm Italian, and I've spent many years of my life living and researching in Southern Africa. I have family in Zambia, and I've also recently started long-term research in Argentina and Chile. I've been living between Norway and Sweden for more than 8 years now. Louis, would you like to introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Louis Römer. Raised in Curacao, born in Curacao, lived in the Netherlands, Great Britain, and have also family in Pennsylvania. And I've been working in at Vassar College for a number of years, here in New York in the Hudson Valley, where I do research and teach on matters such as political rhetoric, discourse, talk radio, populism, and I have a special interest in unconventional and post-ideological, right, political formations, which certainly we're seeing plenty of this election cycle.
Louis and I have been following US politics for quite some time now, so the analysis we're offering on this election really takes into account the last decade or so. In other words, the era that has seen the rise of Donald Trump and right-wing populism. In parallel, of course, with similar trends and patterns in Europe, but also other parts of the world. With our show, we will provide engaging commentary on what Kamala Harris, Tim Walz, Donald Trump, J.D. Vance, and other political players say, but also on how they say it, the vibes, the emotions, the drama. The name of the show, Weird, is a term that went viral when Tim Walz, the vice presidential candidate for the Democrats, a few weeks ago, used it to describe the ideas and policies of his Republican opponents. In the last weeks, it has become almost the defining term for the anti-Trump Democratic messages. Let's hear it straight from the horse's mouth in an interview that Tim Walz had on MSNBC at the end of July.
We do not like what has happened where we can't even go to Thanksgiving dinner with our uncle because you end up in some weird fight that is unnecessary. and I think bringing back people together, well, it's true. These guys are just weird. And it's, you know, they're running for He-Man Women Haters Club or something. That's what they go at. That's not what people are interested in.
We want to zoom in a bit more into Tim Walz. So let's hear also how he presents himself as a man from rural Nebraska.
I know a little something about that commitment to people. I was born in West Point, Nebraska. I lived in Butte, a small town of 400, where community was a way of life. Growing up, I spent the summers working on the family farm. My mom and dad taught us, show generosity towards your neighbors and work for a common good.
Here he is, a rural white American, as white as he gets, speaking common sense, telling us that we should be generous and work towards a common good. Not talking about the dangers of immigration, closed borders, hating people or so on, not winking at some kind of conspiracy about why rural whites might be under extinction, but doing straight talk about being nice to each other. Am I missing something here, Louis? What's happening?
Well, I think we should just start out by saying that Tim Walz really is a living, made into flesh embodiment of populism as a concept, right? He is identifying himself as a common man, right, who lives and breathes common sense, as opposed to some other entity, usually some establishment or some elite somewhere else, right? He is honing in to himself as an everyman, right? Just an ordinary guy, right, with common sense values. So that's how he defines himself. So this is a key element to populism in general. So the key thing that he is doing in this segment is repositioning what common sense, what everyday, ordinary folks are like. He's saying, well, you know, in where I'm from, as a real common man, as a real everyman, we do this. And what that is we look out for each other, but we don't, but we're not scared of difference. He actually, again, even that, he presents this in a positive term, right? He doesn't say we're not scared of others. He's saying we mind our own business and we don't get in other people's business. So he is being very, very, very strategic in defining the everyman in a positive way, right? So not beleaguered, not under threat, not in need of defense by a strong man, and so on and so forth. He's saying we are ordinary people. We believe in helping each other out. We believe in also leaving each other alone sometimes. And so in that way, he can really put what are otherwise seen as progressive or radical or coastal elite positions. He can then reframe them as being common sense, ordinary American, moderate positions.
Let's hear him on freedom, exactly on these parts on freedom. Just another small bite.
I see those old white guys. Some of us are old enough to remember Republicans who were talking about freedom. It turns out now what they meant was the government should be free to invade your doctor's office. In Minnesota, we respect our neighbors and their personal choices that they make. Even if we wouldn't make the same choice for ourselves, there's a golden rule. Mind your own damn business.
think that's a very good example of what you were talking about, Louis. We should say that actually the issue of freedom, it's been a really smart inversion of the whole Harris-Walz campaign. In fact, it started before even Walz got there on the ticket. He basically launched Kamala Harris. Let's listen for a minute to Kamala talking about freedoms.
We fight for a future where we defend our most fundamental freedoms. The freedom to vote. The freedom to be safe from gun violence. The freedom to love who you love openly and with pride. And the freedom of a woman to make decisions about her own body, not having her government tell her what to do.
So what's happening here, Louis? I mean, usually we've heard right-wing populists, also anti-establishment populists, talking about freedom. I mean, it's been years and years of this. Now it's like a centrist Democrat, using the word big government. I mean, a Democrat using the word big government. What's going on?
Yeah, from some of the right-wing commentary that you can hear about this, I think Peggy Noonan in the Wall Street Journal and some others, they're not happy. They're like, those are our things. The Democrats are stealing our things. Things like patriotism, things like even one commentator was complaining like, camel, that's ours, right? So what's happening is an appropriation of certain buzzwords, I guess you can call them, certain forms of turns of phrase that are usually used by the right, but are being taken up here, but given very different meanings, very different content. And freedom is being redefined in a way that centers what are considered to be progressive liberal values. So things like freedom to choose and so on. But I also want to say that in both cases, it's not just, in both Kamala and Walz's cases, it's really not just the accent. It's not, oh, we're delivering progressive talking points in a folksy manner, right, with a Midwestern accent or anything like that. And with Kamala also, she's doing an interesting, and here this is a reference to my dear friend and colleague Nicole Holliday's analysis of Kamala Harris's accent. She's doing a mix of California English and also a little bit of African American vernacular. She's doing some code switching there. So it's not just that, it's delivering these progressive talking points in a style that's indexes common people. It is redefining what those terms involve, like the center, what even the center refers to, what moderate means, what reasonable means, what common sense means. It's really reframing that's happening here that I think is interesting to think about.
So talking about this reframing, so that we can kind of, I mean, okay, what we now know, I mean, if you want, that the Democrats are becoming quite good at using populist styles. So probably that was, I mean, I don't know if it was a necessity, but definitely given the winning of the populist rhetoric, in America and Europe, it seems that, there's very little escaping that. But can you tell us about the two visions? I just put there, in the background, a very good piece by Matt Beai on the Washington Post. He talks about Tim Walz and J.D. Vance in particular, but he's really talking about two visions of America. If you had to summarize, what are the two visions at stake here? If you put the Democratic ticket versus the Trump-Vance ticket.
What we're looking at are two different ideas of what the future is, two different kinds of futures. Notice that in Kamala's speech, she started with a future where, a future where XYZ. As old as, classical rhetoricians like Aristotle would, they define political rhetoric specifically as being oriented around the future. So defining what future you want is really the contest or the argument of every political debate, especially around elections, where the voter is choosing the future they want. Um, so the I guess the Vance version of this is to say this is the future liberals want. This is a popular meme on the internet. Some of you might know this is the future liberals want, and it's I don't know. You'll see a trans woman and a hijabi sitting next to each other in the New York subway, and supposedly this image should scare the audience, or at least that's the premise. But then many liberals have made fun of this, being like, yes, this is the future we want. This sounds like really nice and really pleasant that people of different backgrounds can just get along and mind their own business on the subway, right? So that is really the argument, is what kind of future, what kind of freedom matters? Is it freedom for people of different backgrounds, with different languages, with different sexual orientations, and different identities to be able to do their thing, help each other out when they need to, but also be left alone when they want to? Or is it a different kind of notion of a freedom that's under threat by outsiders, undeserved people, or by traitors in amongst us that are trying to take away our freedom, right? So there's a different sense of freedom as something that has to be defended from them, right?
And I think
in Vance's case.
Yeah, I think my impression also from what we've been following is that, I mean, Kamala and Tim are really pressing on the future, right? That they are forward-looking, while we're hearing a lot of this defensive, what you're saying. Their vision of the future is not really the future; it's more clinging to the past, right? And I think that the Democrats have been quite effective. It's like, you know, your thing is old. It's not just that we disagree with you, but actually you're kind of done. This vision is very old, and I think that Trump and Vance, now to move a bit on the other side, seem to be struggling a bit. I mean, not to, of course. You know, we're clear here that we don't really, like what Trump stands for in any way. But if you had to be a bit more detached as communication specialist, I mean, 2016 still had something new. You know, this guy was new on the scene. He could still play the new kid on the block, and there was something about that white working classes somehow, you know, still to at least was new. It wasn't necessarily correct. We know how much of derailing was there. But what's your feeling now? How is Trump doing on the other side? You know, what's especially since the Biden dropped out of the race?
Well, I think there's a disorientation that happened around the Trump campaign. A couple of things. Yes, there is a the future that was in the Trump campaign, even all the way back in 2016, was "Make America Great Again," which is a kind of interesting temporal inversion. Like, our future is in the past, right? So our future is where we need to go back to. Whereas here, what we're now hearing 2024 is we're not going back, right? That's the slogan. We're not going back. So this is a direct rebuttal to the temporal inversion that "Make America Great Again" stood for, right? So in that sense, we're dealing with that argument on that very core level of like what future we want. Trump was saying we want a future that looks like the past, and Harris and Walz are saying we're not going back.
And what about Trump as a performer? How is he doing if you had to compare, especially to 2016?
Yeah. So another point there is that one key way in which Trump was able to really consolidate an image of himself, to really stay on his message, right, as a kind of vanguard or as a kind of protector of the authentic, real people of America, is by often using quotatives and by transposing his own arguments in the forms of dialogues and quotative speech. So he'll often have these anecdotes where he'll mention probably some fictional person, usually reaching out and grabbing him. This person is often really strong, and his arms are strong, and his fingers dug in my right. So there's often this kind of conversational narrative style that he uses, where he will well, certain people reach out to me and they literally are touching him. So he's literally in touch with the people because they literally touch him. And then they tell him, Donald Trump, you got to build that wall. Right. And that's when, the crowd cheers. They love this kind of aesthetic, which is something that I think Trump probably learned from Rush Limbaugh. Yeah, there are some interesting scholarship that actually looks at this style and how it has emerged over time, and Trump is definitely situated in that tradition. But when we look at Trump in 2024, at least what I've noticed, I was looking for those like conversational, dialogic digressions, and it's not that they're absent. It's just that they are not as frequently there. His speeches become more monologic, and the times when he launches into those conversational dialogic or quasi-dialogical narratives is when he's talking about and now it's the assassination attempt on him. That's when he does it the most frequently.
Yeah, and I think just to add on that, I mean, I agree with you. It's the balance in this Trump speech between this kind of skits, if you want, almost comedy-like,
Yes.
and with impersonations, and it's very dramatic, even the way he moves his body or makes the voices of this fictional person he talks to, and these moments that I call flow of consciousness, right? So he just rambles. So I want to say that perhaps as a bit of a counterpoint. I agree with you that I think this flow of consciousness moment are less effective, but I think there's still something of the charmer there. It's almost telling you a really dystopian lullaby, kind of speak. There's something there where just speaking and speaking, charming you almost as if it's like playing to a snake, those kind of snake charmers. So I think there's still something there. It might not be very expansive in terms of voter base. It now looks like more and more he's got his own church and preaching to the converted, but it's still there. But I wanted to show one of those skits that actually I thought was quite telling, almost a moment of truth, when he still does, those, Trump impersonation moment, just recently in Glendale, Arizona. Let me just play this one.
And they said, Joe, you can't win. You're getting out of the race. No, I want to go and give it a shot. No, Joe, you're getting out of the race, Joe. And if you don't do it the nice way, we'll do it the tough way, Joe. And he said, okay, and now I have a new opponent. This never happened before. We spent $100 million and a lot of time on defeating him. And as soon as he was gonzo, it all started with the debate. The debate. All that time, all that effort. A friend of mine said, you did a terrible job in the debate. I said, why do you say that? Everybody said I was brilliant. They said, no, you got him out of the race with that debate.
I thought this was almost a moment of truth. I mean, he's been basically whining about Joe Biden dropping out of the race. But in this moment, there's almost a reflection in the joke. It's like, actually, I did so well against Joe Biden that I'm now in trouble with a much stronger candidate. So that was at least my takeaway from that. But I mean, the other thing is that it's quite difficult to show many clips from his recent rallies. And again, I don't want to say, it's hard to say Trump gotten worse. I mean, let's be clear. I mean, it was really bad in 2016 too. But it does seem that there is this refrain. A lot of it is really personal attacks, against Kamala and the Democrats. A lot of, as you said, very negative thinking, this kind of clinging to the past and all that. So it's difficult sometimes. I think lots of it really borders on hate speech. I mean, I'm not, a lawyer, and it's not my job to say it lawyer, but really things that are quite, especially on immigration, a lot of stuff is quite worrying. But I wonder, what do you think about this VP ticket, the vice presidential ticket? He's got our age, pretty much, 40-year-old. Is he any better? This JD Vance coming out on the scene. What are your thoughts on him?
Yeah, I think, and this applies to both Trump and Vance here. They've definitely maintained that sense of focusing on these personal attacks rather than focusing on their platform. But then again, both of them have this quality of biting and blowing on the wound of presenting these extremely dire visions of the future, right? And then where all the bad things are going to happen to the audience, and then presenting themselves as the people who will prevent this catastrophe from getting worse.
Exactly. I think
That's
that summarizes a lot of those rallies and speeches.
that's basically the routine. And the personal attacks tend to dwell on both Harris and Walz being inauthentic, not being who they say they are, gaming the system. And with Harris, this often is being racialized, like she's not really Black, or she's only Black because but in any case, all of those are meant to brand them as inauthentic, insincere, also undeserving, right? Because this is a key way in which Trump and Vance define their coalition and their enemy, right? The enemies are the undeserving ones, and they are the righteous ones who have been somehow wronged or betrayed by the establishment or the elite. This is the way they define the us that they're going to fight for, and the them that they are going to punish, basically.
I wanted to give an example of what I think is sometimes really quite extreme, also political opportunism on really big tragedies, like gun violence or drug addiction, which are real problems. So I'm going to play another little bite by J.D. Vance in a rally in Philadelphia earlier this month.
I just want to say, I'm not going to be able to introduce everybody I've spoken to just this morning and early this afternoon. But you've got people who have lost loved ones just in the last few weeks to gun violence because we won't lock up violent criminals in this country anymore, thanks to the policies of Kamala Harris. You've got children who have been orphaned, who have been bouncing around foster homes because Kamala Harris's policies allow this terrible fentanyl into our country that orphan these poor kids. And you've got parents who have lost loved ones, who have lost children, because we keep on allowing the Mexican drug cartels to turn our country into a drug trafficking zone. It is normal people who suffer when Kamala Harris refuses to do her job, and it is normal people who stand to benefit the most when we re-elect Donald J. Trump, President of the United States. And that's what we're going to do, right? That's exactly what we're going to do.
I mean, what we've seen just now in the Vance clip, it's exactly what you were talking about, Louis, right? So you first set this catastrophe here, this really big plague of drug addiction connected to heroin, fentanyl, you name it. And then, they blame, of course, Kamala Harris and the Democrats, and then they put themselves, of course, Trump and Vance as the solution to this catastrophe, right? So I think that was very good example, sadly, of this very, what I would have said, very cynical, very extreme political communication tactic. What I wanted to also stress for our audience is the context here. He's not just talking about it. Basically, he's in a low-income neighborhood in Philadelphia. He gets on stage 2 women to talk about, somebody lost I think it was their daughter to heroin, overdose. The other one is a brother who's struggling with addiction, basically living testimonies. So this is very rapacious, in my opinion. I think we should also say it sometimes as it is. It's difficult to, kind of massage it. But that's the kind of communication that we're seeing a lot of these rallies. Anyway, I think we made a clear contrast here between the Democrats and Republicans. I mean, not only about content, but again, our show really wants to focus a lot on styles, styles of communications. But there's something more about not everything is well in the Democrats' house, right? So there were some issues at the Democratic National Convention. So I think it's important for us to mention it. You, Louis, have been involved also through your teaching. You are actually in the States while I'm based here in Norway. So you have followed the contestations around Palestine and Israel quite closely. What happened there? I mean, we heard, for instance, the Muslim Women for Harris disbanded and said we can't really, support Harris after what we've seen at the Democratic National Convention, earlier this week. Can you tell us a bit more about this? What's going on that front?
Yeah, there's a lot that has happened that makes me concerned, because as we saw just now in the clip of Vance, part of how the communication strategy really works effectively is by taking on and addressing real traumas, people losing loved ones to gun violence, to crime, and so on, and then giving that trauma a very specific kind of narrative that points out who's to blame and what's the solution, and also in a way the narration itself is meant to re-trigger and re-traumatize those who have those real traumas. Okay,
Yeah, I
so
think that's a
I
very good
think
point
that's something
from. If I
to
may
think.
interject briefly, that's a very good point you made. I wanted just to stress something because,
Mhm,
again, it's important for the communication style. They're very dramatic in the way they reenact this. It's not just talking. There's
mhm.
something very emotional about it, and I think that's where the dystopian, disturbing aspect comes in. People are really supposed to then feel the anxiety, the trauma, the suffering. It's not a
Mhm.
neutral or some kind of glossing over or sanitizing the
Yeah,
stuff, but it's basically to
it really is biting someone
Mhm.
and then blowing on the wound. That's the metaphor that I often use to think about that style. But it's good to think about as we think through the Israel-Palestine issue and how this is going to play out. Um, Unfortunately, there is an opening, right? Because what's happening in Gaza is so viscerally horrible, right? There is an opening precisely for this kind of style to thrive, yeah, because the violence, the death, the dismemberment, it's all interspersed in people's social media feeds, especially young people whose Instagrams and TikToks have practically been flooded with just images of war. Yeah. And so that's what I've seen, at least where I work, is that a lot of what really motivates people, motivates students to take a position on Israel Palestine is really quite visceral. It's
Mhm.
not so abstract. It's not conceptual, right? It's really just seeing all this bloodshed quite intimately as one is scrolling, in their dorms,
Mhm.
and then being confronted with what's happening.
So
So
if I have to push it a bit there, because I think we saw some of these debates on Twitter, on X now,
mm,
and other social media, right? So there were some commentators saying, well, if the aim of having Palestinian voices on stage, we know the Democratic National Convention basically refused to have any Palestinian speaker on stage. If the aim is just to shatter the narrative, somebody I think used that word of disrupt the festive atmosphere, so to speak.
yeah, I
But
think
I
that
mean, here
was
we're talking about real suffering, right? We have these massive killings of civilians in Gaza. It's a humanitarian situation that is awful. And of course, the more the war continues, the more the hostages that Hamas has also have very little hope of being saved. So there is a tragedy going on.
yeah.
Thousands and thousands of Palestinians kill innocent civilians. So how, what do you think about that? Was that the right choice for the
I
Democrats?
think I think there's some observations we can make about the DNC that tell us that the argument about whether mentioning Gaza would spoil the mood, I don't think so. I mean, the applause lines that were often the loudest in many of the speeches were the ones that addressed Gaza directly, ending the suffering in Gaza, right? AOC, what have you, the Reverend Warnock, right? Anytime Gaza was mentioned, and specifically ending, right, the war in Gaza, uproarious applause, right? So clearly, even in the audience there at the DNC, people wanted to hear something about that. So I don't know if not excluding a Palestinian voice was the best choice. And it should be also mentioned that the RNC did feature an Arab American speaker,
Mhm.
right?
Yeah.
So they,
The Republican National Convention, for the
yes, the
audience that
Republican
doesn't follow.
RNC, yes, that's right. The Republican National Convention did feature an Arab American voice,
Mhm.
although I think this case was a Iraqi Chaldean. And of course, from the progressive side, from the liberal side, you can dismiss that as tokenism. However, it just shows that Republicans are watching carefully and observing the places where they can insert wedges. Another viral clip that went around on right-wing social media was of a prominent hijabi woman in a Trump rally. Hijabi meaning wearing a headscarf, and with the T-shirt Muslim women for Trump, right? So that shows that ideally, right, one would want to stake their claim on that issue, right, and not leave that terrain uncontested for the other side to define it in ways that are disadvantageous. And I think by not taking the uncommitted movement's offer of having a speaker, a Palestinian American speaker, who would have endorsed would have endorsed the Harris Walz ticket, right? And made the argument for why why she, as a Palestinian American, is endorsing. That would have been a very powerful way to come up ahead of these kinds of wedge politics. But yeah, so that's really a missed opportunity.
And I think a bit of context there about the uncommitted movement. So basically, these were the delegates who were not committed, to either Biden, and then were not still decided about Harris, who basically represent, I think, a few 100,000 votes in several American states,
Yes.
who then were putting pressure on Harris to say, we are looking at you, we want to dialogue with you, but, the Palestine issue is really important. Convince us. So this is still a very open contest. The situation is not this. This will continue, and we know that in Michigan, Arab American vote is quite important. So this can make the difference in some of the battleground states.
Let me just briefly explain a little bit more, like that. The uncommitted delegates are basically representing registered Democrats who voted in the Democratic primaries, right? So the fact that they're there at the DNC, this is not the same as the street protests. That's a different phenomenon altogether that were happening at the Democratic National Convention in Chicago. This is the uncommitted movement. Are these delegates that were voted in basically to represent a contingent, a constituency of Democratic, ostensibly loyal Democratic voters who wanted to see some shift in the platform, right? So what those uncommitted delegates were doing is really trying to negotiate a shift in the platform of the Democratic Party in exchange for an endorsement, right? So these people were putting that on the table as it's like, we'll endorse you if we see XYZ. I think for them, it was ceasefire and arms embargo. Or some people have also framed it as conditionalities on weapons transfers to Israel, right? So in any case, I think that conversation remains ongoing. But in any case, in terms of just representation, that was, and in terms of political communication and rhetoric, that was a missed opportunity to feature somebody who say, I'm Palestinian, I endorse Kamala, right? That would have been, right? That would have added a different context for the conversations that would be much more beneficial for the Democrats moving forward.
And of course, we're talking about United States of America. There is the big issue of U.S. empire and military industrial complex. So we know that no matter what the messaging says, there are clear contradictions there, left and right, when it comes to this bipartisan consensus on key geopolitical issues. We know that it gets quite complex, and we know actually that even previous elections have been really, really torn by these issues. Look at the propaganda against Clinton also, but think about Obama. I'm really thinking more about the Obama years. The wish of Barack Obama to do something, getting that Nobel Peace Prize perhaps a bit too early, and then a whole kinds of series of events on the global stage that still then forced him and that kind of center left back into empire. So I think that contradiction remains there. But it's important even here to look at the other side, right? So we had a bit of news that just came up basically on Friday, is that Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who's the son of Senator Robert F. Kennedy and nephew of the assassinated US President John F. Kennedy, so basically as a Democrat family as you get, a dynasty, a Democratic dynasty in America, was running his own independent third party, so to speak, campaign, not with the Democrats, not with the Republicans, basically ended up endorsing Trump. Now, his campaign has been a bit of a mixed bag, to say the least. He's bringing together this kind of conspiratorial undertones against big business and big pharma, with messages about peace in Ukraine. And all of this sounds quite leftist, but then you look at the Ukraine messages and are quite close to some of the Kremlin's talking points, basically propaganda, beyond the issue of the really thorny issue of war there. But here too, then they all end up in the right. So he end up endorsing Trump. Major donors from the Republicans were also funding him. Timothy Mellon in particular, there's been some news just coming out how he's putting in a lot of money both into the Trump campaign and into RFK Jr.'s campaign. Timothy Mellon is the grandson of this big business tycoon, Andrew Mellon. And, for many of you who have, foundation, fellowship, scholarship, you would have heard of the Mellon name, in so many parts. But I want to just play a clip of RFK Jr. taking the stage at a Trump rally in Glendale, Arizona on Saturday.
Don't you want healthy children? And don't you want the chemicals out of our food? And don't you want the regulatory agencies to be free from corporate corruption? And that's what President Trump told me that he wanted. He also told me that he wanted to end the grip of the neocons on U.S. foreign policy. He said he didn't want any more $200 billion wars in Ukraine, that we could use that money back here in the United States. And the best way to build a safe America is to rebuild our industrial base and rebuild the middle class in this country. And don't you want a president who's going to get us out of the wars and who's going to rebuild the middle class in this country?
If we didn't see Trump there, just said that, if we didn't hear the Trump word there, he almost sounds convincing, like we're taking out all the controversy over Ukraine, Russia. But let's say we're pro-peace, we agree that children's, diseases due to this awful contamination of foods, it's bad. And he's quite convincing. Unlike Vance, who sometimes tries to do this attempts at, some kind of leftist tropes, he sounds like a leftist. What's going on here?
Yeah, I think listening to somebody like RFK, I try to always put myself in the mindset of somebody who just doesn't pay a lot of attention to political news, and maybe just has progressive leaning inclinations, vaguely defined, inchoate, but not super ideological, and certainly not super committed in terms of partisan political identity. In the US, it's a major thing. People are Democrats in the same way as, some people root for FC Barcelona and the football team, the soccer team, and some people root for Real Madrid, right? So it's there's this loyalty. Many voters in the US don't have that partisan attachment to the Democratic brand or the Republican brand. And to those people, this could sound very appealing if they don't know the details, if they don't, cross-check with other accounts with whether what he's saying is true but it sounds, indeed, it sounds like, anti-war. Don't we want wars to end? Yeah, of course we want wars to end, right? Don't we want our kids to be not poisoned? Yeah, that sounds like a good idea, right? So on the on the surface, it sounds very pro. It almost sounds leftist. Like, we want to end, the grip of the neocons. I thought that was a really interesting moment. And the cheers that then happen at that point really indicates that the anti-war message resonates even with the Trumpian base. They say, yes, we want the wars to end, and we want the money, invested in this war to come to us.
I think I put there on the background just now the piece that has been published some years ago in the Boston Review, a major magazine that publishes a lot of scholars, but also in a more kind of engaged scholarship, not just for a more general public, by two scholars, William Callison and Quinn Slobodian. They basically coined this term, diagonalism, okay, and diagonal thinking. So basically, they're saying that these new movements, and this is really something that is, picking up in the last few years. It's also connected to the growth of social media and the kind of mixing or this hybridization of this communication platform. Is what you were saying there. We get more and more people who don't have a brand anymore. They don't have their football club. They're online, and they might get some Trump messages, some Kamala's messages. Then they get RFK there, and then they kind of pick and choose. So what we're seeing here is that this kind of convergence, they're mixing left and right messages. So you get a lot of people who can speak really good leftist language, but they also put in very right-wing kind of messages together, especially on protection, defense, the threats, right? So the thing that to me is very conservative, even beyond what the threat is. I think you put it very well early on. But of course, as we've seen with RFK, it's almost the trajectory that Slobodian and Callison put there. No matter how much they mix left and right, they tend to go towards the far right. And that's exactly what we saw, right? RFK went on, Junior went on for a whole year or so saying, no, he really doesn't like both sides, then gets money more from one side than the other, and then ends up endorsing Trump. So I think this is an interesting part. This phenomenon is really much bigger, and I think we will discuss it more in the future show. I think the other point, perhaps to stress for our audience, I think you hinted at it into what you just said, is that we're seeing, at least here, we don't know, up to now it wasn't really a theme in the campaign, but since this rally, this endorsement and this rally on Saturday, this idea of Trump as an anti-war candidate might be coming back. We don't know how much is going to be used, but this was very strong in 2016. I mean, if you remember, even big commentators like John Pilger, who was, very classic leftist commentator, putting these really abrasive messages of how Trump was more anti-war than Clinton. I mean, beyond whether people were in good faith or not back then, I mean, we know after 4 years of Trump that, to present him as that, that's not the case. But I think it's important, again, to debunk a bit those ideas. I mean, while Trump talked, did the withdrawal from Syria, his friend, who's a private military contractor, one of the most problematic, Eric Prince, was actually talking about bringing his own private militias, in Syria. So, it's very unclear how that withdrawal from Syria was so pacifist or so anti-war. But even the whole Trump undermining on NATO, effectively, and his tough kind of transaction business, the European allies have to pay up. We can't just foot the bill from America. That's been one of the major, not the only, of course, but one of the major drivers of European increase in defense spending, with all the, bad effects on wars and conflicts that we're seeing, whether it's Ukraine, Israel, Palestine, or beyond. So I think and finally, his position on Ukraine, I mean, it's ridiculous, to say the least, if it wasn't a tragedy there, because he's not acknowledging any of the responsibility of his, ally Vladimir Putin, who basically, invaded Ukraine. So Trump is refusing to acknowledge that somehow Putin had any wrongdoing in that invasion. So we'll see whether this anti-war thing will come back in play. But it's kind of interesting to see these returns, right, Louis? I mean, we've been following this now for 8-10 years, and then some of these tropes just keep on returning.
Yeah, this idea that somehow Donald Trump is going to somehow outflank the Democrats on traditionally what were considered to be left-wing positions. But I think part of the reason why this sort of argument gets as far as it does is that, to some extent, right, diagonalism as a phenomenon that's emerging, neither left nor right, and so on. To some extent, what we are seeing is the dissolution of traditional left-right camps and the formation of a lot of very different kind of what could be termed hybrids or syncretic, mixed positions. So you could think of centrism as a kind of mixing of left and right, but that's very different from diagonalism, to be very sure. But it's just proliferating in all different directions. But at the end of the day, right, the diagonalism does tend to flow towards, right, just like water is flowing down to the sea, neither left nor right tends to flow towards far right in the end. And we'll see. We'll probably see more of this as even as just a tactic to create confusion, to create a messaging that will help to suppress or dim the enthusiasm on the liberal side. So just confusing a few people, reducing the turnout here and there on the margins will be good.
We covered quite a lot in this episode, so it's time to wrap up. You're following Weird, a global take on the US election, hosted by Vito Laterza and Louis Römer. Please make sure to subscribe to our channels, whether you get our show in the main podcast platforms, such as Apple Podcast or Spotify, or on YouTube, X, and Facebook. We will be back in 2 weeks' time with the next episode with more vibes and drama from the US election. You can get in touch with us by email at info@weirdpodcast.com. And also make sure to subscribe to our newsletter at www.weirdpodcast.com so that you will get our next episodes straight in your inbox. Until next time.